You know, usually when we talk about history, there is this incredibly ingrained expectation of, well, dust.
Oh, definitely.
Right. Like, think back to your high school classroom. You probably picture these dry, heavy textbooks that weigh like 10 pounds.
Yeah, the ones with the endless lists of names.
Exactly. Names, dates of treaties you absolutely don't care about, and just a succession of kings staring blankly out of oil paintings.
It's, a very static view of the world.
Completely static. You picture a timeline stretched across a chalkboard where facts are just pinned up there like dead butterflies, and your only job is to memorize them.
Right, we're taught to treat the past almost like an accounting ledger. You tally up the wars in one column, the agricultural revolutions in another, and eventually you take a test.
A ledger of the dead. That's a
Yeah.
great way to put it. It just sits there, unchanging. But then you step into the world of today's source material, and suddenly that entire timeline just shatters.
It really does. It's a total paradigm shift.
We are looking at a philosophical landscape today that completely upends what the concept of history even is. The premise we're exploring is almost sci-fi, honestly.
Sounds like it, yeah.
It argues that true history isn't about memorizing the past at all. It's about experiencing a form of like literal mental time travel,
Hmm.
a process where you are rethinking the actual living thoughts of the dead right now inside your own mind.
Which is, it's massive. To accept this premise requires us to completely abandon the way we were taught to process information.
Right.
We have to stop looking at historical figures as data points and start looking at them as minds that we can essentially boot up on our own internal hardware.
So for you listening, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we have a really dense, highly rewarding, and frankly mind-bending academic excerpts on the table. We're exploring the philosophy of a man named Robin George Collingwood.
He lived from 1889 to 1943.
Right. And what makes him fascinating right out of the gate is this dual life he led. He was the Waynflete Professor of Metaphysical Philosophy at Oxford, swimming in these deep theoretical waters.
Which is prestigious enough on its own.
Exactly. But simultaneously, he was a practicing boots-on-the-ground archaeologist. He was literally out there digging up Roman Britain.
That combination is incredibly rare, and it's actually the key to his entire worldview.
Because he wasn't just in the library.
Right, he wasn't just an armchair theorist spinning ideas out of thin air, and he wasn't just a laborer blindly cataloging pottery shards. He had the dirt under his fingernails and the philosophical framework to understand what that dirt actually meant.
So our mission for this deep dive is to take Collingwood's insights and fundamentally shift how you understand the very concept of, well, knowledge itself.
We want to show you how penetrating what Collingwood calls the inside of historical events can completely transform the way you process the world today.
Yeah, this isn't just a lesson about ancient Rome. It is about how you understand human action, period. So, okay, let's unpack this. Because to really grasp why Collingwood's ideas are so explosive, we have to understand the Goliath he was trying to slay, right?
Oh, absolutely. The intellectual climate of his time was stifling for an historian.
Right, so what was that climate in the late 19th and early 20th centuries?
He was operating in an era completely dominated by the runaway success of the natural sciences. Think about what was happening in the century leading up to his work.
The Industrial Revolution, right?
Yeah, physics, chemistry, biology, they were completely rewriting the rules of human existence. You had Darwin, you had breakthroughs in electromagnetism. Science was explaining the universe through observation, meticulous experimentation, and the discovery of universal laws.
It was working really, really well.
It was. The success was so staggering, so undeniable in its practical applications, that a pervasive belief took root in academia and just culture at large.
It's sort of physics envy.
Extreme physics envy. The belief, which the text refers to as positivism and naturalism, was that the scientific method is the ultimate and perhaps the only template for all valid knowledge.
Wow, the only template.
Yeah. If you wanted to be taken seriously in any field, your work had to look, sound, and function like natural science.
So if you're an historian sitting in a university in, say, 1910, watching the chemists get all the funding and the glory because they keep discovering these universal laws, you start thinking, hey, I need to find the universal laws of history.
That is exactly what happened.
Yeah.
The prevailing legacy of 19th century positivism was the view that the historian's role should be identical to the natural scientist's role.
They wanted their own laws of gravity.
Right. They wanted to subsume historical events under universal laws. They believed that historical persons and actions could be approached externally, just like a chemist observes a reaction in a beaker.
So you just gather data.
Exactly. You gather the raw data of human history, you look for the statistical patterns, and you extract the universal law of human behavior.
And did the historians of his day just accept this physics envy?
Not just accepted it, they built massive, comprehensive systems around it.
Who are we talking about here? The source mentions a few heavy hitters, right?
Right? Collingwood specifically takes aim at the massive intellectual frameworks built by people like Oswald Spengler, Arnold Toynbee, Auguste Comte, and Karl Marx.
And they were all very different thinkers.
Wildly different. It's important to note that these thinkers had wildly different political and social goals. They disagreed on almost everything practically.
But Collingwood saw a common thread.
He saw them all as infected with the exact same underlying philosophical disease naturalism.
Whether it was Marx looking for economic laws,
Or Spengler looking for cyclical laws of civilizational collapse, right? They all shared the mistaken prejudice that the only true explanations are those that show particular occurrences as instances of general laws. They were trying to turn history into a branch of physics.
I was trying to think of a way to visualize this positivist approach to history to really capture how absurd Collingwood found it.
Let's hear it.
It feels a bit like trying to understand a complex game of chess by acting strictly as a physicist.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Right, so imagine a scientist observing a world championship chess match. They meticulously measure the physical weight of the winning pieces down to the microgram.
To get all the data.
Exactly. They calculate the exact friction of the felt bottom sliding across the polished board. They record the precise velocity and trajectory of the player's hands moving through the air.
Very scientific.
Very. They gather mountains of pristine, peer-reviewed scientific data about the phenomena of the game. But they completely ignore the rules of chess.
Oh, wow.
And they completely ignore the strategy taking place inside the player's minds.
That captures the flaw perfectly. The physicist in your scenario has flawlessly described the external movements, the kinetic energy, the physical bodies in space. But they have absolutely zero understanding of what is actually happening.
They just see wood moving.
Right. They don't know why the knight moved in an L shape, only the physical force required to lift it. They don't understand that a pawn sacrifice was a brilliant tactical trap. They just record that a piece of wood was removed from the board.
And Collingwood is looking at these massive, scientifically styled histories of his peers, these grand theories of civilization, and saying, you are just measuring the weight of the chess pieces. You are missing the entire game.
What's fascinating here is why Collingwood's stance was so radical. He wasn't just nitpicking about how to write a better history book.
He was going deeper than that.
He was making a massive philosophical claim about human knowledge. The text notes a powerful remark from his autobiography, where he states that the chief business of 20th century philosophy is to reckon with 20th century history.
Meaning philosophy shouldn't just be about interpreting science or math anymore.
Right. For Collingwood, treating scientific inquiry as a fruitful field for philosophy was perfectly fine. Science does its job incredibly well.
Sure.
But neglecting the claims of history, or trying to force history to be a pupil to natural science, keeping it in a state of pupillage, as he called it, leads to catastrophic misconceptions about who we are.
Because history is its own thing.
He asserted that history is an autonomous discipline. It is not a branch of science. It has its own unique procedures, its own categories, and its own criteria for truth.
So it's totally separate.
The historian's understanding of their material is of a completely unique character, fundamentally different from how a botanist understands a fern.
And I want to pause here because this is exactly why this matters so much for you listening today. Think about our modern world.
We are saturated in data.
We are. We are still absolutely obsessed with data and scientific metrics to explain human behavior. We rely on algorithms, statistical models, and big data to predict what people will buy, how they will vote, what they will click on, and who they will date.
We really are.
We're still living deep inside that positivist dream, trying to turn the messy reality of human action into a predictable physics equation.
We find tremendous comfort in external metrics because they feel objective, they feel safe. If I have a spreadsheet with 1 million data points, I feel like I know the truth.
But Collingwood is challenging you to realize that human actions require a completely different toolkit to truly understand.
Because data only goes so far.
Right. If you only look at the data, the external movements, the click-through rates, you are completely blind to the reality of the human experience. You are just a physicist watching a chess game.
Which naturally brings us to the core of Collingwood's alternative. If history isn't just the accumulation of physical data and the search for universal laws, what actually is it?
Right. How do we define a historical event?
He introduces a fundamental distinction that every historian must make. Every event has two sides.
The outside and the inside.
Let's break those down carefully, because this is the foundation of his whole theory. According to Collingwood, the outside of an event means everything belonging to it, which can be described in terms of bodies and their movements.
The physical stuff, the things you could capture on a camera or measure with a tape measure.
Precisely. The text gives a famous classical example. The passage of Julius Caesar, accompanied by certain men, across a river called the Rubicon at a specific date.
Okay.
Or, looking later in his life, the spilling of his blood on the marble floor of the Senate House in Rome. Those are the outside elements. Physical bodies moving, water splashing against armor, metal piercing flesh, blood spilling.
And a scientist or a positivist historian would stop there. They would log the coordinates, the date, the volume of blood, the type of metal used in the daggers, and call it a day. They'd add it to the ledger.
But then we have the inside of the event. By the inside, Collingwood means that in the event, which can only be described in terms of thought.
Just to be clear, we aren't talking about neurology here, right? We aren't talking about synapses firing in the brain because it's still physical.
Right, synapses firing would still be the outside. By thought, he means the conscious intention, the strategy, the conceptual framework.
So what's the inside of the Caesar examples?
So, for the crossing of the Rubicon, the inside is Caesar's deliberate defiance of Republican law. It's the calculated risk of civil war. For his assassination, the inside is the clash of constitutional policy between Caesar's vision of an empire and his assassin's desperate attempt to preserve the republic.
It's the invisible architecture of the moment. Without the inside, Caesar crossing the Rubicon is just a guy wading through some water.
Exactly. And Collingwood insists that the historian is never concerned with either of these to the exclusion of the other.
They need both.
History is not just the study of disembodied ideas floating in the ether, nor is it just the study of bodies moving around blindly. He uses a very specific word. He says the historian is investigating actions, and an action is the unity of the outside and the inside of an event.
The unity. They are welded together.
They're inseparable in practice. A mere event, in his vocabulary, is something that only has an outside and no inside, like a meteor striking the moon. History doesn't deal in mere events. It deals in actions.
Okay, I follow that.
Now, the historian's work might begin by discovering the outside of an action. You dig up the bloody toga, you find the ancient coin, you read the physical document. But it can never end there. The main task is always to think oneself into this action, to discern the thought of the agent.
Let me push back on this for a second because the positivist argument still has some teeth, I think.
Sure, let's hear it.
Doesn't a scientist also look for the inside or the hidden cause of a natural event? If I'm a volcanologist studying a volcano erupting the ash cloud, the lava flowing down the mountain, that's the outside.
Right.
But I don't just record the lava. I look for the tectonic plate shifts, miles underground, the pressure buildup, the hidden geological forces. Isn't that looking for the inside? Isn't the scientist doing the exact same thing?
It's a really perceptive question, and Collingwood anticipates this exact confusion. He clarifies it by looking closely at how we use the word cause. It turns out the scientist and the historian use the word cause in completely different ways.
Okay, lay it on me. How does a scientist use it?
When you look for the hidden tectonic forces, or to use the text's specific example, when a chemist asks, why did that piece of litmus paper turn pink? The scientist is moving in a very specific direction of inquiry.
Which is?
The scientist is looking for the general law of nature. What they really mean is, on what kinds of occasions do pieces of litmus paper turn pink?
They are looking for the rule, the universal rule that applies to all litmus paper everywhere in the universe forever.
Yes. They go beyond the specific individual event to observe its relation to others, bringing it under a general formula. They group events into classes.
So they zoom out.
Exactly. For science, the event is a phenomenon, a spectacle presented to observation. The search for the cause is conducted by assigning that phenomenon to a broader class of phenomena.
So the scientist's instinct is always to go wider. They zoom out from the specific piece of paper to all paper.
But the historian goes deeper. They zoom in. When the historian asks, why did Brutus stab Caesar? They aren't looking for a general law of stabbing.
No, of course not.
They aren't asking, Under what atmospheric conditions or at what level of economic inflation do Roman senators tend to stab dictators?
Which would be a ridiculous, absurd way to rate history. It was a Tuesday with high humidity, therefore a stabbing occurred.
It would be absurd, yet that is exactly what the positivist systems of Spengler or Comte were inching toward. But a true historian means, what did Brutus think, which made him decide to stab Caesar?
So it's about the specific thought.
Right. The cause of the event, for the historian, means the thought in the mind of the person by whose agency the event came about.
So the cause isn't gravity or pressure or a socioeconomic cycle. The cause is a specific idea in a specific person's head at a specific moment in time.
And Collingwood says something incredibly profound here about that cause. He says that for the historian, this cause, this thought, is not something other than the event. It's the inside of the event itself.
It's baked right in. It's not a separate thing pushing the event from behind. It is the core of the event.
Yes. For history, the object to be discovered is not the mere event, but the thought expressed in it. He writes that to discover that thought is already to understand it.
So once you have the thought, you're done.
Right. After the historian has ascertained the facts, there is no further process of inquiring into their causes. When you know what happened, meaning you know the thought inside the action, you already know why it happened.
Because the what and the why are unified in the thought. If you know Brutus thought Caesar was destroying the Republic and Brutus thought the Republic had to be saved at all costs, you don't need to look for some external law of physics or sociology to explain the dagger thrust.
Exactly.
The dagger thrust is simply the physical manifestation of that exact thought.
Which leads to Collingwood's ultimate central maxim, the sentence that defines his entire philosophy. All history is the history of thought.
That's a huge claim.
It is. The processes of nature are sequences of mere events. But the processes of history are processes of actions, which have an inner side, consisting of processes of thought. What the historian is looking for is these processes of thought.
All history is the history of thought. That is such a massive, sweeping statement. It completely redefines the job description of the historian. You aren't a data collector, you are a thought detective.
A thought detective, absolutely.
Yeah.
But that immediately presents a rather glaring logistical problem, doesn't it?
It presents a huge problem. If history is exclusively about finding the thought, the immediate, urgent question is, how on earth do you access the thoughts of someone who has been dead for 2,000 years?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. We don't have a time machine. We don't have telepathy. We just have old rocks, pieces of parchment, and broken pottery. How do you get from a piece of crumbling parchment to the living thought of a dead emperor?
And this is where Collingwood introduces the mechanics of his version of time travel. He states that there is only one way the historian can discern these thoughts. The only way to know them is by rethinking them in your own mind.
Rethinking them, literally doing the thinking yourself.
He uses a great example to illustrate this. Imagine an historian reading an ancient document, specifically the Theodosian Code, and looking at a certain edict issued by a Roman emperor.
Okay, let's build this scenario. Picture yourself at a dusty desk in an archive. You've got this ancient Latin text in front of you. You can read Latin perfectly. You translate the words on the page. You know exactly what the grammar says.
Collingwood argues that merely translating the words from Latin to English does not amount to knowing their historical significance.
Because that's just the surface.
Right. That is merely philological knowledge. It's language translation. It gives you the outside of the document.
You've got the vocabulary, but not the history.
Right. To gain actual historical knowledge, you have to do so much more. You must envisage the situation with which the emperor was trying to deal. And you must envisage it exactly as that emperor envisaged it.
You have to build his world inside your own head. You have to know that the barbarians are at the northern border, that the treasury is running out of silver, that there's a grain shortage in the capital, and that a rival general is getting too popular.
All of that context.
You have to load all those variables into your own brain.
And then, once the variables are loaded, you must see for yourself, just as if the emperor's situation were your own, how such a situation might be dealt with.
You play it out.
You must survey the possible alternatives he had. You must weigh the reasons for choosing one alternative rather than another. You essentially have to go through the exact same agonizing decision-making process which the emperor went through in deciding to issue this particular edict.
You have to become him intellectually for a moment.
He says that thus the historian is reenacting in his own mind the experience of the emperor. And it is only insofar as he does this that he has any historical knowledge of the meaning of the edict. Think of it like a musician covering a classic song.
Oh, I like that. How does the song cover fit in?
Well, if you want to understand a piece of complex sheet music, say Beethoven's sonata, you can't just stare at the ink on the page.
No, that won't make music.
And you aren't really understanding it if you just listen to a recording of someone else playing it. To truly understand the music, the phrasing, the emotional turning points, you have to sit down at the piano yourself.
You have to play it.
You have to run the music through your own fingers. You provide the physical effort, the breath, the emotional resonance to bring those dead notes back to life in the present moment. You are reenacting the song using your own instrument.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the song cover analogy highlights how active this process is. History isn't a passive consumption of facts, it's a labor. You have to sweat a little bit to play the sonata.
It is immense work. Collingwood emphasizes that this reenactment is not passive. It is a labor of active and therefore critical thinking.
It's not just daydreaming.
No. He writes that this reenactment is only accomplished so far as the historian brings to bear on the problem all the powers of his own mind and all his knowledge. It is not a passive surrender to the spell of another's mind. You don't just light some incense, go into a trance, and let Caesar's ghost take over your body.
Right, you aren't being possessed. You aren't channeling spirits.
Far from it. The historian reenacts the past thought in the full context of his own knowledge, and therefore, in reenacting it, he criticizes it.
He judges it.
He forms his own judgment of its value. He corrects whatever errors he can discern in it, based on hindsight and broader context.
So as I'm thinking the Roman emperor's thought, I'm holding his variables in my head, but I'm also holding my own modern knowledge. I might realize, oh, he chose option B because he firmly believed the grain supply from Egypt was secure. But with my modern historical perspective, I know the Egyptian grain supply was actually already compromised by a drought he didn't know about yet. So his thought, while logically sound based on his premises, was based on a flawed premise.
Exactly. You are thinking his thought, but you are also judging his thought. And Collingwood says this criticism is not something secondary or optional. It is an indispensable condition of the historical knowledge itself.
It's baked into the process.
He says nothing could be a completer error than to suppose that the historian merely ascertains what so-and-so thought and then leaves it to someone else to decide whether it was true. All thinking is critical thinking. The thought which reenacts past thoughts criticizes them in the very act of reenacting them.
If you aren't doing the critical work, you aren't really thinking. You're just mindlessly repeating.
He calls mere repetitions dry bones. A translated text without the reenactment is just dry bones. They aren't history until someone is able to clothe them with the flesh and blood of a thought which is both his own and theirs.
Pause right there. A thought which is both his own and theirs. That phrase, that is the trapdoor to the absolute deepest philosophical puzzle in this entire text.
It really is. It opens up a massive paradox regarding identity.
Right, because if I'm bringing my own critical judgment to bear, if I'm analyzing the emperor's decision from my modern viewpoint, sitting in my comfortable chair with my own knowledge, how can I possibly claim that the thought I am having is the same thought Plato had or Caesar had? It feels like a contradiction.
It's the crux of the issue.
Yeah.
Collingwood tackles it head on. He sets up the dilemma perfectly. He asks, if I now rethink a thought of Plato's, is my act of thought identical with Plato's or different from it?
It has to be one or the other, logically speaking.
Let's look at the consequences of each option. If my thought is fundamentally different from Plato's, then my alleged knowledge of Plato's philosophy is sheer error.
I'm just making it up.
I am not knowing Plato. I am just knowing my own modern distortion of Plato. The historical connection is severed.
Okay, so to have history, it has to be identical.
But look at the flip side. If it is literally identical, if I am having the exact same cognitive and sensory experience Plato had, it implies I have achieved total oblivion of my own mind.
Which is impossible.
I would have to forget I am a modern historian, forget the last 2,000 years of human events, and literally become Plato sitting in ancient Greece, which is a psychological impossibility, not to mention a metaphysical one.
So we are completely stuck. It can't be different, or history is false. It can't be identical, or history requires magic. How does Collingwood break us out of this trap?
He solves it by introducing a crucial philosophical distinction between two different aspects of thought, immediacy and mediation.
Immediacy and mediation, we need to define those carefully because they are the engines that make his time travel concept work.
Let's start with immediacy. Immediacy refers to the actual, unique, unrepeatable experience of the thought as it happens in a specific moment in a specific body.
The sensory part of it.
It is organically united with everything else going on in that person's life at that exact second.
So the total sensory and emotional context.
Yes. When Plato was thinking about the nature of the soul, his immediate experience included the feeling of the humid weather in Athens that day. The specific political gossip he had just heard in the agora, maybe a literal stomachache he was dealing with from bad wine, the precise emotional tone of his current friendships.
Just the feeling of being alive in that moment.
All of that incredibly rich, localized texture is the immediacy of the thought.
And in that sense, my thought and Plato's thought are entirely irreparably different.
Huh.
I'm sitting in an air-conditioned room with a laptop, drinking a latte. I don't have a stomachache, and I don't care about Athenian gossip. My immediacy is completely modern.
Collingwood entirely agrees. In their immediacy, as actual lived experiences, Plato's thought and yours are different. You cannot reenact the immediacy. That moment in time is gone forever.
So if the immediacy is lost, what can I reenact? What survives?
You can reenact the thought in its mediation. Mediation refers to the logical structure of the thought itself, completely independent of its immediate sensory context.
The structure.
It is the core argument, the reasoning, the conceptual framework.
The meat of the idea, the skeletal logic.
The source gives a very specific example to illuminate this. Imagine reading Plato's argument in a dialogue called the Theaetetus, where he argues vigorously against the view that knowledge is merely sensation.
Okay, so Plato is arguing that just seeing something or feeling something isn't the same as truly knowing it. Knowing requires a higher level of processing.
Right. Now, in its immediacy, Plato's argument must have grown out of a very specific, heated discussion he had. He was probably targeting specific sophists in Athens who were promoting this sensation theory.
But we don't know the specifics of that.
We don't necessarily know who those specific people were or what the exact trigger for the debate was that morning.
We don't have the context of the argument.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, Collingwood argues that we don't need that immediate context to understand the thought itself.
Really?
If you read Plato's argument in the Theaetetus, understand his starting premises, follow his logic step by step, and re-argue it within your own mind, going through the exact process of reasoning he went through to reach his conclusion, then the process of argument you go through is not merely resembling Plato's. It actually is Plato's argument, so far as you understand him rightly.
Let me pause and play devil's advocate here. Isn't context everything? I feel like modern historians are always beating the drum that you can't understand historical figures without understanding their context.
It's a common objection.
If I don't know the exact room Plato was sitting in or the political stakes of his argument that day, haven't I lost the reality of his thought? How can a thought exist outside of the wet, messy brain that produced it?
It is a profound objection, and it's one a positivist would absolutely make. But Collingwood says we have to realize that an act of thought is not just a passing experience, like a sensation or a feeling.
Like the stomachache.
Think about a toothache. If you have a toothache, that is a sensation. It exists only in your immediate experience. I cannot feel your toothache. I can sympathize with you, I can give you aspirin, but the toothache itself cannot travel across time and space into my jaw.
Thank goodness for that.
But an act of reflective thought, a logical argument, has a unique, almost magical characteristic that a toothache doesn't have.
Which is?
Collingwood writes that a reflective thought has the characteristic of being able to sustain itself through a change of context and revive in a different one.
It's portable.
Highly portable. The argument itself, starting from premise A, leading through deduction B to conclusion C, can exist in Plato's mind, surrounded by the context of ancient Athenian debate.
And it can exist in mine.
And it can exist in your mind, surrounded by the context of modern discussions about artificial intelligence or empiricism. The thought does not lose its identity just because its surrounding context changed.
I think I get it. It's like a mathematical equation. Take something simple, like 2 + 2 = 4.
That's a perfect parallel.
That precise logic existed in the mind of an ancient Babylonian merchant who was counting sacks of grain on the banks of the Euphrates. And that exact same logic exists in the mind of a modern software engineer coding an app in Silicon Valley.
The context is wildly different.
Unfathomably different. The clothes, the smells, the immediate purpose of the math, all different. But the mediated thought, the fundamental logic of addition, is literally identical. The engineer is thinking the exact same thought the Babylonian thought.
That is a brilliant translation of the concept. And that shared logic is exactly how history is possible. The gulf of time is bridged because the logical structure of the thought can revive itself in the historian's mind.
You just provide the space for it.
You provide the modern home, the new biological context, but the guest living in that home, however briefly, is the ancient thought itself.
That is a beautiful way to look at our connection to the past. But it also seems to draw a very strict, almost harsh line.
It does.
If this kind of portable, logical thought is the only thing we can reenact, does that mean there are huge swaths of the past that we simply can't reenact? Now that we know how powerful this thought revival is, does that mean everything that happened in the past gets to be called history?
Far from it. This leads directly into how Collingwood fiercely draws the boundary around his discipline. He places extremely strict limits on what actually counts as historical knowledge.
Okay, so let's map the perimeter. What isn't history?
First and foremost, as we touched on earlier with volcano, history cannot be the history of nature.
Right, because a volcano doesn't think. A tectonic plate doesn't have a strategy.
Exactly. Nature undergoes processes. It has evolution, it has creative changes, it has massive chronological events. But unless natural events are the purposeful actions of a thinking being, they are not historical.
So dinosaurs aren't history.
Our knowledge of nature might look like history because it's chronological. First the dinosaurs roamed, then the meteor hit, then the mammals took over. But it is not historical knowledge because we cannot rethink the thoughts of an asteroid or a fern. They have no insight to penetrate.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. No history of rocks or reptiles. What else gets thrown out?
Secondly, and this is much harder for people to accept, history cannot be the history of near immediate experience.
The flow of consciousness.
The flow of consciousness, sensations, feelings, the immediate raw data of living, the toothache we talked about. You can remember your own past feelings, or you can enter with profound sympathy and imagination into the feelings of others. But you're not reenacting them.
You're just observing them.
You are contemplating them as objects external to your present self.
So if I'm studying the intense, raw emotions of people in the past, what am I doing, if not history?
Collingwood says you are doing psychology. Or, at its absolute best, you are doing poetry, but you are not doing history.
Wow. That cuts out a lot of what we usually consume as history.
It does. And thirdly, building on that, he makes a razor-sharp distinction between biography and history.
Wait, biography isn't history? I feel like the biography section is literally half of the history section in any bookstore. You read a biography of Lincoln, you assume you are reading history.
You are reading a mix of both, but Collingwood argues that the underlying framework of a biography is essentially biological, not historical.
Biological.
The absolute limits of a biography are biological events, the birth of a human organism and the death of a human organism. Its framework includes childhood, sexual maturity, senescence, diseases, eating, sleeping, the accidents of animal existence. All of that is a natural process.
The biological life cycle, the meat suit we walk around in.
Yes. And he uses this incredible poetic metaphor to describe the relationship between this biological life and actual history. He says the bodily life of the man is like a stranded wreck, and the tides of thought flow crosswise through it, regardless of its structure, like seawater flowing through a stranded wreck.
That is haunting. The body, the biology, is just the wrecked ship on the beach, and history is the invisible water flowing through it.
Yes. He acknowledges that many deep human emotions are bound up with the spectacle of bodily life. Biography feeds those emotions, and it might result in great moving literature. But the record of immediate experience, say, a diary faithfully preserving the flow of sensations and feelings, is not history.
So what does this all mean in practice? Let's ground this.
Sure.
Imagine I find a diary from a Civil War soldier, and the diary is just day after day of raw, immediate experience. I am so hungry today. My feet are freezing in the snow. I miss my mother terribly. I'm terrified of the cannon fire I hear over the ridge.
Right, a very common type of historical artifact.
It is heavily emotional, faithfully preserved, an incredible artifact of the human experience. But according to Collingwood's rules, that is absolutely not history.
According to his strict definition, no, it is not history. It is the record of natural animal appetites, hunger, cold, fear, and the immediate sensations of psychological suffering.
It's just biology.
It is a biological and psychological record of a human organism under stress.
That feels almost cruel to say. It's so human. It's what connects us to the past emotionally.
It is entirely human, but for Collingwood, being human biologically isn't enough to make it history. So far as man's conduct is determined by what may be called his animal nature, his impulses and appetites, it is non-historical.
So hunger isn't history.
The historian, strictly speaking, is not investigating the fact that men eat and sleep and make love and try to stay warm. Those are natural, universal processes that belong to biology and psychology.
So where does the actual history start for that Civil War soldier? If the freezing feet isn't history, what is?
History starts not with the appetite or the sensation, but with the thought that addresses the appetite.
The thought about the cold.
The text says the historian is interested in the social customs which men create by their thought as a framework within which these appetites find satisfaction in ways sanctioned by convention and morality.
Let me see if I have this. The feeling of hunger in the soldier's stomach isn't history. But the incredibly complex logistic system the Union Army invented to try and get hardtack to that specific soldier, the supply lines, the railroad schedules, the requisition forms, the economic policies behind the food distribution, that is history.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
that involves purposeful, reflective thought that I can reenact.
Exactly. The feeling of blind terror from the cannon fire isn't history. You can't reenact his specific adrenaline spike. But the tactical formation the general devises to manage that terror, to hold the line, to maneuver the troops, to win the battle, that is history.
Because it's a plan.
Because that strategy is a mediated thought you can reenact. You cannot reenact the soldiers shivering, but you can reenact the general strategy.
Okay, that boundary is incredibly stark. It really forces you to filter out the massive amount of noise from the past and look for the specific signal of actual thought. Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle.
Right.
Having ruthlessly eliminated the biological, the natural, and the purely emotional, what exactly is left? What is the specific scope of history? What kind of thought qualifies?
The object of historical knowledge must be reflective thought.
Reflect, meaning what exactly in this context?
Meaning it must be an act done on purpose. It must be a reflective effort to do something of which we have a conception before we do it.
Like having a goal in mind.
We know what it is we are trying to achieve so that when it is done, we can judge if it was successful based on our initial plan.
It's premeditated, it has a goal.
Yes. Collingwood contrasts this with two opposing errors in philosophy. On one side, you have thinkers like Samuel Butler, who exaggerated the place of reason so much that he argued even an infant must know how to suck or it couldn't do it.
Making everything sound logical.
He tried to make completely unreflective, instinctual acts look reflective just to fight against materialism. On the other side, you have people who argue that we never truly know what we are going to do until we do it, because life is always surprising, chaotic, and immediate.
Right, the fly by the seat of your pants theory of human existence, the idea that we're all just improvising and rationalizing it later.
Collingwood rejects both extremes. He says, yes, reality is surprising, but we still make plans. We still intend to do things before doing them. These reflective acts done on purpose are the only acts which can become the subject matter of history.
And traditionally, at least before Collingwood, people thought this on-purpose criteria only applied to a very narrow slice of human activity, like kings making laws or generals fighting wars.
Yes, Collingwood calls this the Hegelian error. For a long time, the dominant theory, heavily influenced by the philosopher Hegel, was that the only possible subject matter of history was the practical life of men.
Practical life.
Politics, warfare, economic life, the mechanics of the state.
Why did they limit it to that?
Because of a concept often translated as the objective mind expressing itself outwardly. In plain English, Hegel thought history was only about big, physical institutions, states, armies, legal systems, because you can see them imposing order on the physical world.
That's obvious.
Building a state or fighting a war is obviously done on purpose. You make a plan, you rally an army, you execute it. It's visible.
But because of that obsession with visible institutions, they assumed other things couldn't be history.
Exactly. They assumed that theoretical activities like art, science, religion, philosophy could not be history because they assumed that these things were not done on purpose in the same way.
They thought they were spontaneous.
They thought of them as happening in the dark, without a prior plan, just pure inspiration striking the genius.
Like a scientist just stumbling around a lab mixing chemicals until something explodes. Or a painter just throwing paint at a canvas in a frenzy until it looks good.
Right. They viewed a theoretical discovery as a happy accident, not a planned expedition. But Collingwood says this is a massive error. Today, he notes, it is no longer necessary to argue that art, science, religion, and philosophy are proper subjects of historical study. We accept that they are.
We have to know why.
We must understand why they are. And the reason is that theoretical thinking is a purposeful activity.
He gives a really clarifying example of a scientist inquiring into the cause of a disease, specifically malaria.
Yes. If a scientist is trying to find the cause of malaria, they have a very definite purpose in mind. They don't know the answer yet. They don't know what the specific biological cause is, but they know what finding the cause will look like.
They have a test.
They have tests, hypotheses, and criteria for success established from the start.
So even when we are completely in the dark about the final answer, the framework of our question is a purposeful thought. The scientist is saying, I don't know what the bug is, but I know it must satisfy these specific conditions, it must be found in these specific blood samples, and it must react to these specific treatments.
Exactly.
That framework is a reflective thought. And because it's a reflective thought, a future historian can completely reenact it.
Exactly. The theoretical inquiry is actually a practical activity in its initial stage. Conceiving a purpose is already in action. Collingwood says the scientist, the historian, and the philosopher are proceeding according to plans, thinking on purpose.
So it's trackable.
And because they are thinking on purpose, they arrive at results that can be judged according to the criteria derived from those plans.
So you can track the history of an idea just like you track the history of an empire.
Yes, but this raises an important question about how we actually do that tracking. How do we study the history of ideas, or what historians often lazily call influences?
Right, like how did Socrates influence Plato? Or how did Descartes influence Newton? We hear those phrases all the time.
Collingwood says the concept of historical influences is entirely futile if you view it as simply decanting ready-made thoughts from one mind into another, like pouring water from a pitcher into a glass.
As if Socrates just handed Plato a USB drive of his philosophy, and Plato just plugged it into his brain and hit save.
That is not how thought works. Thought is active. An intelligent inquiry into influence doesn't just seek to discover points of agreement or copied answers.
Then what does it look for?
To interpret the thoughts of past thinkers, the historian must discover the specific problem the historical figure was trying to solve.
The problem, not just the answer.
The problem is everything. Collingwood points out that in practice, the most common and difficult task for the historian is identifying the problem.
Why is that so hard?
Because thinkers are usually careful to expound the steps of their thought and their final answers. But they're talking to their contemporaries who already know what the problem is. They're swimming in the same cultural water, so the writer might never explicitly state the problem at all.
They just jump straight to the solution, assuming you know what they're fixing. It's like finding a random key and having to deduce what the lock looked like.
And unless the historian knows what the lock looked like, what the problem was that the thinker was working on, they have no criterion by which to judge the success of the work. You can't evaluate an answer if you don't know the question.
So true inquiry into influence like Socrates to Plato isn't about what answers Plato copied. It seeks to discover how the conclusions reached by Socrates gave rise to the new problems for Plato.
Exactly.
Socrates solved X, which accidentally created problem Y, and Plato spent his life trying to solve Y. The history of thought is the history of evolving problems.
And finding that problem, figuring out what exact question the dead were trying to answer in their own minds, is the ultimate detective work of the historian. It is the prerequisite that makes reenactment possible.
That is just incredible. We've covered a staggering amount of ground today. We started with Collingwood as this rebel archaeologist fighting against the positivist idea that history should just be a hard science, tallying up data points and looking for universal laws.
We saw how he split every event into the outside physical movement and the inside thought, insisting that history is solely the investigation of that inner thought.
And then the mechanics of time travel. The idea that to know history, you literally have to invite the dead into your own living mind, providing your modern context to host their timeless, portable, logical arguments.
While carefully filtering out the noise of biological bodily functions and pure emotional sensations, focusing entirely on reflective, purposeful thought, identifying the problems they were trying to solve.
History isn't a ledger of dead facts. It is the active, critical reenactment of purposeful past thoughts within your own living mind. It bridges the gulf of time by making you, the historian, the right man to study that object, pre-adapted to become its host.
It fundamentally changes the very nature of what it means to be informed. It's no longer about memorization. It's about mental expansion.
It really does. And for you listening right now, this is where the rubber meets the road. The next time you are reading an article about a past event or studying a historical figure or, frankly, even trying to understand a colleague's baffling decision at work, don't just look at the outside bodies and movements. Don't just look at the data points of the final outcome.
Penetrate the inside.
Yes. Ask yourself what the specific problem was that they were trying to solve in that moment. Try to literally rethink the logic of the people involved. Become the host for their thought. When you do that, it turns the consumption of information from passive memorization into an active, critical expansion of your own mind. You aren't just learning what happened, you are expanding your capacity to think.
And as we close, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, inspired by this deep dive. We have established that for Collingwood, historical knowledge only truly exists in the moment, that a past thought is successfully reenacted in a living mind. It requires a living host to breathe life into it.
Right. It only exists as history when it is being actively thought right now.
So what happens to the events and the thoughts that no one is currently thinking about? If history requires a living mind to reenact it, do vast, unstudied stretches of human history literally cease to exist as history? Are the thoughts of millions of people just waiting dormant in the dark like inactive code on a hard drive until some modern mind comes along, asks the right question, and boosts them back up into reality?